They say some people are born into destiny, others are born into debt. And then there are people like Evan Calder, born into a world so padded with money and praise that gravity never quite worked on him. By the time Evan was 28, the headlines were already written for him. Heir apparent takes the throne, a new era for a billion-dollar empire. What the headlines didn't say was how fragile that empire really was, or how close it was to being handed to the one person who could destroy it, because 6 months later, thousands of lives would be shaken, a legacy nearly erased, and a quiet man named Richard Calder, Evan's father, would reveal that everything his son believed about power, inheritance and family was built on sand. And the most painful truth? The real test was never the company, it was Evan himself. Richard Calder didn't build Calderon Biotech by accident. He built it molecule by molecule, contract by contract, failure by failure. 40 years of early mornings, late nights, and decisions no one applauded at the time. By 66, the company was valued just north of $3 billion, supplying critical treatments across multiple continents. So when Richard stepped onto the stage at the transition press conference, the room rose to its feet, and then Evan walked out. Tailored suit, relaxed grin, hair perfect in that effortless way that only comes from never having to worry. He looked less like a future executive and more like someone headed to a private rooftop party. Still, the cameras loved him. Richard placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "This company," he said carefully, "has always been about responsibility. About people before profit." Evan leaned into the mic and laughed. "Don't worry, I've watched you do this my whole life. I'll take it further." The room clapped, the board smiled politely. But something passed between the older executives, something unspoken and uneasy. They had seen Evan grow up, they knew the truth. Evan's preparation for leadership had been symbolic at best, occasional board meetings, brief internships that ended early, a reputation for expensive weekends and louder nights. His social circle was stacked with influencers, trust fund friends, and people who called him bro more than boss. And at the center of it all was Naomi Brooks. Evan's mother, dark-skinned, composed, elegant in a way that came from survival, not wealth. She'd grown up far from boardrooms, far from safety nets. When she married Richard, she entered a world that never fully felt like hers, but she made it work. For Evan, she watched from the front row as her son accepted applause he hadn't earned yet. Her smile was tight. After the conference, Richard pulled Evan aside. "This isn't a title," he said quietly. "It's a weight." Evan clapped his father on the back. "Relax, you didn't raise a failure." Richard nodded, but his eyes said something else, because what Evan didn't know was that his father hadn't truly let go, not yet. Richard had spent years watching Evan avoid discomfort, avoid consequences, avoid growth. Every safety net had become a ceiling Evan never noticed. And now, standing at the edge of retirement, Richard made a decision that terrified him. He would stop protecting his son for the first time. Evan walked into the executive suite believing the crown was his. The corner office, the assistants, the power to sign, fire, approve. And in those first weeks, everything felt intoxicating. People laughed at his jokes, executives waited for his approval. Friends suddenly had brilliant business ideas. Evan told himself this was confidence, that he was finally stepping into who he was meant to be. But confidence built on privilege has a weakness. It doesn't know what to do when the room stops clapping. And somewhere deep inside Richard Calder, watching silently from the shadows, was a man counting down the days, not to see his son succeed, but to see who his son really was when no one caught him from falling. Quick question before we continue: if you inherited a billion-dollar company tomorrow, would you be ready to lead, or would you just feel ready? Let me know in your mind, because what Evan does next changes everything. Hey there, my wonderful family and friends, welcome back. If you're ready to dive into today's story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from. I love seeing where everyone's watching. And guess what? There's another amazing story coming your way tomorrow, one you definitely don't want to miss. Alright then, let's get started. Power didn't change Evan Calder overnight. It revealed him. The first decision came fast. Almost impulsive, 3 weeks into the role. Evan stood in the executive conference room, sleeves rolled up, confidence buzzing. "We're bloated," he said. "Too many people, too much history. We need to move lean." No one spoke. Then the notices went out. Nearly 1/3 of the workforce gone, people who had helped build Calderon Biotech from the ground up. Scientists, administrators, logistics managers. Some had been there longer than Evan had been alive. Evan framed it as efficiency. The markets reacted positively for exactly 12 days. He filled the empty roles with people he trusted. College friends, social connections, men who talked big and asked few questions. Titles were handed out like party invitations. Experience became optional, loyalty became currency. Naomi tried to reach him, he sent her to voicemail. Richard watched quietly. Month 2 brought bigger swings. Evan approved aggressive pricing changes on essential products. He wasn't cruel about it, at least not in his mind. He spoke in numbers, not faces. "The demand is locked in," he told the board. "People will adjust," but people didn't adjust. They protested, advocacy groups spoke out. Media coverage shifted from curiosity to concern. Clips of Evan surfaced online, old videos, careless jokes. Private moments never meant for daylight. The narrative flipped. Not a leader, a caricature. The stock slipped. Evan blamed bad press. Then blamed outdated advisors. Then blamed everyone but himself. By month 4, the pressure was relentless. That's when Marcus Hale appeared. Marcus ran a fast-growing medical investment firm. Sharp suits, smooth voice, endless confidence. He took Evan to exclusive restaurants, private events. Places where success felt guaranteed. "You're thinking too small," Marcus told him. "You don't protect legacy by playing safe. You multiply it." Richard had warned Evan about men like Marcus. Evan remembered and ignored it. The merger proposal landed on his desk wrapped in promise. Immediate growth, global expansion, a chance to reverse the narrative. The board hesitated. Evan pushed it through. 2 weeks later, everything cracked. Regulatory inquiries, frozen accounts, emergency meetings. The partner company was under investigation for financial manipulation, and Calderon Biotech was suddenly tangled in the fallout. Markets reacted brutally, shares collapsed, contracts paused, confidence evaporated. Inside the company, panic spread. Departments shut down, projects were halted midstream. Thousands of employees stared at uncertain futures. Evan stopped sleeping, for the first time in his life. No amount of money could soften the fear. Then came the knock, not literal, but official. Investigators, lawyers, endless questions Evan didn't know how to answer. He called his father, no response. He called his mother, Naomi answered. But her voice was different now. "Your father is handling this," she said. "You need to listen." Evan didn't understand what she meant. The board met without him, and when the doors reopened, Richard Calder walked back into the building he'd never truly left. Calm, controlled, prepared, he addressed the company first. Then the press, then, finally, his son. In a private room, Richard placed a folder on the table. "These documents," he said, "were never finalized." Evan flipped through them. His appointment papers, his authority, his control. None of it was legally binding. Richard spoke gently, but every word landed hard. "I needed to know who you were when I wasn't protecting you." Every decision Evan made over 6 months. Reversible, every agreement, contingent, every mistake. Contained. Richard moved fast. He dissolved the merger, restored pricing, rehired critical staff, stabilized operations. The company survived, Evan didn't. At the next press conference, Richard stood alone. "My son is not ready to lead this organization," he said. This was a test. He failed. No anger, no drama, just finality. Evan watched the broadcast from his apartment. Surrounded by luxury that suddenly felt hollow, he wasn't just losing a title. He was losing the story he'd been telling himself his whole life, and as the legal battles loomed, Evan made one last decision: to fight his father. Not knowing that the truth waiting in the files would erase more than his claim to power. It would erase the name he thought defined him. Pause for a moment. If the safety net you depended on disappeared tomorrow, who would you be without it? Because in the final act, Evan finds out painfully. Evan Calder believed the lawsuit would restore balance, control, dignity, at least a piece of what he'd lost. What it uncovered instead dismantled him. During discovery, the legal teams requested sealed family records, documents Richard had locked away decades earlier. At first, Evan barely paid attention. He assumed it was procedural, a technicality. Until his attorney went quiet, the room felt smaller as the file slid across the table. A test, a date, a signature from 28 years ago. Evan stared at the page, rereading it, waiting for it to change. Richard Calder was not listed as his biological father. The air left his lungs. The truth arrived in fragments after that. Conversations he barely remembers, Naomi sitting across from him, hands folded, eyes wet but steady, the story she and Richard had buried to protect him. An affair, a mistake, a choice to raise Evan anyway. Richard had known since Evan was 2 years old, and still stayed. The lawsuit collapsed almost immediately. Without legal lineage, Evan had no claim to the company, the name, or the legacy he'd wrapped himself in. The public reaction was swift and merciless, commentary, speculation, labels that stuck, not a villain, but not a leader either. The legal consequences faded, quietly resolved. The reputational ones did not. Evan moved, changed his last name, sold what he didn't need. For the first time in his life, he applied for work without leverage. No introductions, no shortcuts, just him. 5 years passed. He landed in pharmaceutical sales. Not glamorous but honest, early mornings, long drives, rejection, small wins that felt bigger than any applause he'd ever received. He learned what it meant to earn trust instead of assuming it. Richard, now in his 70s, continued running Calderon Biotech. But differently. No family successor, no sentiment, just competence. In his office, one framed photo remained. Evan at 7 years old, smiling, unaware. When asked why he kept it, Richard said only this: "Love without boundaries can become a lie." Evan read those words in an interview years later, and something in him softened. He called Richard. They spoke for hours. Not as executive and heir, not as victor and failure. Just two men who had both waited too long to be honest. They began meeting once a month. Simple dinners, no business talk, no rewrites of the past. Evan apologized first. Richard followed. The inheritance was already gone, redirected to research and foundations. Evan didn't ask about it. He didn't need to. At 33, Evan earned a promotion, regional manager. Nothing flashy, but real. He called Richard out of habit, then hesitation. "I'm proud of you," Richard said. This time, the words stayed, because they were earned. What Richard left Evan wasn't money or power. It was the one thing privilege never taught him: how to become someone worth trusting, and sometimes, that's the only inheritance that lasts.
Thank you for watching all the way through. If this story moved you, the next one will surprise you in ways you won't expect. Go ahead and click the video on your screen. Your next story awaits.